Hey everybody, I wanted to go over the topic of Moses' seat and how that applies to talking with Catholics, especially somewhat knowledgeable Catholics. So when you're doing apologetics with Catholics, and I guess this was more common prior to Francis, they're going to be saying you need the Pope, and now they're going to say more, because Francis is pretty much not Catholic, they're going to say Catholicism in general, or they're going to say the Magisterium, or previous Magisterium decisions are needed to know things, either for the canon, or how do you know this verse means this, and ignoring the fact that only a handful of verses have probably been defined infallibly over the course of 2,000 years. All right, so when responding to those arguments, the next obvious step is to compare that claim against history. And what we can see is that in an era without an infallible magisterium, we had basically most of pre-Christian history from Abraham onwards. The period of the judges, and obviously there was a lot of problems, but even right before Jesus, when Jesus shows up, we see Jesus expecting people to know what is in Scripture, even though there wasn't an infallible magisterium at the time. They knew that Isaiah was Scripture, and somehow they were able to do this without an infallible magisterium. So what they will point to, what Catholics will point to in lieu of that, in response to that, is the Seat of Moses passage. Okay, so let's look at the passage itself. Right. So when Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Do and observe whatever they tell you. Okay, this is an important part. Do and observe whatever they tell you. Okay, let's highlight that. Let's highlight the whatever. Whatever they tell you. But not the works they do. For they preach but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders. But they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. And they love the place of honor at feasts, and the best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. And you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers, and call no man on your earth your father on earth. All right, so on and so forth. Okay. All right, so what this is, so what they want to point out to was there was something kind of like a proto-papal throne or something like that, like Peter's seat, Peter's chair, cathedra, and that the Pharisees were sitting there, and Jesus tells them to do whatever they tell you. So see, there was something akin to a magisterium. Now, the main problem with that is that we know that just from inside this text, right, they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear. How could they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear? They would have to teach that. That's something that they were told. So whatever Jesus is meaning in this passage, and this is why the Catholic response can't work, it can't mean... It must, this do whatever they tell you must be limited in some way. All right? Now, there are different speculations about what this means. I think that people aren't entirely sure, and what the best guess is that Moses' seat, which they found an example of a couple centuries later, but it's later, so they can't be 100% certain, was just the teaching authority from being in church. Essentially, they were reading from the Torah, and when they tell you to do something in the Torah, you should do something in the Torah. All right. Let's look at another passage which should help us drive this point home. All right, so from Matthew 16, when the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Okay, but at this point, let's concentrate that it implies to the Pharisees. And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, "We brought no bread." But Jesus, aware of this, said, "O you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven and the Pharisees." Then they understood they did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So let's look at that. Teaching of the Pharisees. What would that mean if the teaching of the Pharisees is included of something to be aware of? That means don't do whatever they tell you. All right? In the way that the Catholics kind of want to say. They're teaching something religiously. So Matthew 23, unless you want to think Jesus is contradicting himself, is not about that. Okay? It doesn't mean everything in that sense. It means it's limited. Okay. Then let's also remember, and I'll post a video link in the description, but the Pharisees taught from the oral law. All right? And that Jesus condemns the oral law. And this, there's a whole, I'll post another video we did previously on this, which goes this into more detail. All right? But this is another good example of something I should let you guys know. When you hear something from a Catholic apologist, go to the United States Catholic Bishop's Bible and look up the reference, because a lot of times Catholic academia, learned Catholics, will disagree with the Catholic apologists. So let's look at what the Roman, the Magisterium says about this passage itself, okay? Without the lay magisterium of bloggers and Twitter people have taken their seat. Okay, so this is on the passage we're saying. It is uncertain whether this is see, it's uncertain. All right, it's uncertain whether this is simply a metaphor for Mosaic teaching authority or refers to an actual chair on which the leader sat. It has proved there was a seat so designated in synagogues at a later period than this gospel. So about do and observe everything they tell you. Since the Matthean Jesus, another thing about the Catholic hierarchy is they're a little more, way more liberal than the Roman Catholic bloggers and apologists and even regular apologists. Since the Matthean Jesus abrogates the Mosaic law, warns his disciples against the teaching of the Pharisees. This is referencing 16, but their reference here is wrong. It's not Matthew 14, but they're trying to reference Matthew 16. And in speech denounces the Pharisees as blind guides in respect to their teaching on oaths. So what that's referring to is later down here. All right. So woe to you, blind guides. So in other words, a teaching in the same passage that Jesus says, don't follow. All right. Don't make Jesus contradict himself in the same passage. Even if you thought he was just a man, that's not why. That's kind of not a wise thing to do. All right. This commandment to observe all things whatsoever they tell you cannot be taken as the evangelist's understanding of the proper standard of conduct for his church. All right. So in other words, no. The Roman Catholic apologists are wrong. Even the Roman Catholic higher-ups know the Roman Catholic apologists are wrong because they can read the text. All right, the saying may reflect a period was largely Jewish, so on and so forth. Okay, so by and large, that's one thing to show. Let me see. Let's look at Matthew chapter 11. So one other thing to mention in Matthew chapter 11 is, I'm not sure if this is the correct understanding of Matthew chapter 11:28, but for when all who are labored and burdened, they take this to mean burdened by the law as expounded by the scribes and Pharisees. So in other words, not, at least according to Roman Catholicism, or at least as is being taught by the present day Magisterium, not everything that the Pharisees taught you should listen to. All right, there are some other issues that we should mention. One is that the Pharisees, let's look at this here. All right, let me get my handy-dandy flashlight, spotlight. Look at this. When were the Pharisees founded? Pharisees were founded at 167 BCE. So BC for you non-academic folks. So before Christ, before the Common Era. The Pharisees were a relatively recent sect. So if this was referring to some sort of quasi-infallible magisterium, why, if a recent sect could sit on it, couldn't Protestants sit on this recent sect? So the other main problem is that what comes before validates what comes after. You can see this in Deuteronomy, is that you have to test a later prophet based on what's in the Torah. So if the Pharisees had the authority to expound on the Torah, they would have the authority to invalidate Jesus' messages, like, no, you shouldn't listen to him. And if you take Matthew 23 to mean what the Catholic apologist means, that means you shouldn't follow Jesus. Okay? So I think that's it for this topic. Just hit me up in the comments if you have any questions that I didn't address, and we can hash this out. All right, have a good day.